And then, so that's actually, so that's coming back to the ILO criteria. So it's good to have the criteria incorporated now, or hopefully we see that being incorporated. But in my view, it will not be a substantial game changer. Why is that? Because we're not working on the larger problem, actually. The larger problem, in my view, is the mechanism we have built into, or that have been built into the European Union's legislation pieces, which are not based on a reversal of the burden of proof and which are also not based on rebuttable presumption. And that makes it way more difficult, or that's what I assume, for the union to actually enforce this and hold companies accountable. And the last slide is, and that brings me to the bigger picture, well, we actually need to have a more systematic approach in tackling this. My idea is we have to look at autocracies more broadly. Change through trade has failed, and we need to address this problem. And in my view, it cannot be addressed with patchy regulations forcing on this or that, like forced labor here or human rights infringements there. We need to have a comprehensive approach, categorizing autocracies depending on their risk exposure, and in that view, categorizing business activities and see where we can leverage more demands on businesses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for convening this panel, and to the victims of Communism Memorial Foundation for bringing us together for the China Forum today. It is honestly surreal to me how many Uyghur friends and Uyghur American friends I have who have family members back in Xinjiang who are forced to labor. And they know this. They have evidence for this. That their family members are forced to labor is no accident. It is a purposeful decision by the Chinese Communist Party to enslave the Uyghur people. And this makes it so that the US government and, frankly speaking, the entire world, the international community, should feel as if they have no choice to act. And that, combined with the atrocity determination that was made under the previous administration, did lead Congress to act and to pass the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which of course is landmark legislation to counter Uyghur forced labor. The law did some really important things. Arguably most importantly, it clarified what the US goals and aims are when it comes to tackling the Uyghur forced labor challenge. I think it made clear that at a minimum, we are seeking to ensure that American consumers are not inadvertently perpetuating Uyghur forced labor. That's one goal. But the second goal is to ultimately end the CCP's enslavement of the Uyghur people. And to do that, we need help from countries all across the globe. It has now been more than 2 years since the law went fully into effect. And I wanted to take stock of what's been achieved so far and where we can come together to generate results going forward. And so to that end, I released a paper earlier this year at the Hudson Institute called Strengthening the Implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which takes a really hard look at both the challenges and the opportunities that the US and the international community have to tackle Uyghur forced labor. Since I authored that report, I've been very encouraged in many ways to see US government action that places a higher premium on the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act as a tool in broader US government foreign policy. There are a growing number of entities that have been added to the entity list. My paper was out roughly around the end of May, and since that time, over 20 entities have been added to the entity list, which suggests that that process for being able to alert businesses to the risk of doing business in Xinjiang is strengthening and increasing. So this has been hugely encouraging to me. And of course, earlier this month, the US government announced new reforms to de minimis aimed at e-commerce businesses to curb misuses of de minimis in general. I will note that though those reforms are very welcome, they were not exclusively aimed at forced labor, and that when the Biden administration put out specific guidance after they made these reforms, that they also called on Congress to take further action. So I don't think this is the done deal here, but definitely an encouraging good step forward. For all that has been done, there are still challenges that do remain. I noted in my paper, for example, that when you look at the UFLPA dashboard, which is updated regularly by Customs and Border Protection, the volume of goods, both in terms of the value of the goods, the dollar amount, and the number of shipments that have been investigated and looked at, in my mind, are lower relative to the scale of the problem. And Adrian addressed this with his figures that he's put out, that there's over 3 million Uyghurs, the largest state-sponsored program of forced labor in the world. And I would say that the shipment value is still low, even though this is immense progress to just have those shipments being detained, investigated. But of the percentage of goods and shipments that are investigated, approximately 1/3 of them are only found to be tainted with Uyghur forced labor. And I would imagine that that number is quite a bit larger. And so I look forward to seeing greater enforcement in the years to come. And I think there are elements of the law that remain under-enforced, and also there are things that you and I can be doing to introduce supplemental, helpful measures that will only strengthen implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And so to that end, the report that I put out for Hudson offers 13 recommendations on what the U.S. government can do. I won't be able to cover all of those during this conversation, so that's my shameless plug to go and actually read the report in full. But I wanted to highlight 3 of what I would argue are the most important next steps that I would love to see from both Congress and the administration. Number one, I'd like to see CBP make use of the fining authorities that it has pre-existing, and to collect those fines and place them into a fund for survivors of Uyghur genocide. Under U.S. Code 1592, CBP has the authority to fine importers for fraud, gross negligence, and negligence. And there's also precedent for issuing civil penalties to companies that use forced labor and then subsequently import them into the U.S. I'd love to see CBP make use of those in the Uyghur forced labor context. And I think these fines, combined as well with sanctions and the profits that are often confiscated through fines from sanctions, could go into a fund specifically for survivors of Uyghur genocide. I think this fund should be created regardless of whether or not it's collected from these specific fines or from another source, because Uyghur survivors of the ongoing genocide, particularly those who are subject to forced labor, they need support in the forms of cultural and language preservation, survivor support in the form of counseling and therapy, support for Uyghur-led businesses, even support for immigration and asylum seekers who may need funding, and other things. So that's my first recommendation. The second recommendation is to prohibit imports produced with Uyghur forced labor from being re-exported. A lot of folks are not aware of this, but CBP has the authority to detain goods under 19 U.S. Code 1499. Once a shipment is detained, importers have a range of options for what they can do with it, including re-exportation, and even if CBP believes the good was produced with forced labor. So this would be prior to a determination being made on the good. The ability to re-export, in my mind, and to be clear, not all of the goods that an importer decides to re-export are automatically produced with Uyghur forced labor, but some of them might be. To me, this is a cop-out for those businesses that really haven't been doing the due diligence that they need to make sure that their supply chain is clean. And I don't believe that an importer should be able to profit from those imports in another market. And this is why it's so important for us also to be working with partners and friends to ensure that those goods produced with Uyghur forced labor are not finding homes in other markets, and that companies, American or otherwise, are not profiting from those. The third recommendation is to strengthen sanctions tools to target Uyghur forced labor. That means making full use of pre-existing sanctions tools, including the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, which was amended by the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act to include the ability to target individuals and entities for committing forced labor violations. The Biden administration, to my knowledge, has not issued a single sanction under Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act on forced labor grounds, which is a huge oversight. And the tools in the toolkit have just generally been very underutilized. I would also love to see Congress introduce secondary sanctions to supplement our pre-existing primary sanctions to be able to target even further those who are enabling Uyghur forced labor. I know that I said I was only going to give 3 recommendations, but since the administration did recently make adjustments on de minimis and called on Congress to take action as well, I would suggest that CBP should use existing authorities to ban violators of Section 307 of the Tariff Act of 1930 and UFLPA from using de minimis entry. So Congress could create the ability for CBP to say, if you are a repeat violator of the UFLPA, if you are continuing to import goods produced with Uyghur forced labor, you should go on a banned list where you're not able to use tariff-free entry, which is a privilege, and you will have to then go through ordinary entry, among other activities. There are, I could go on and talk about a lot more recommendations because there's so much that can be done. But I think, there are so many ways that the U.S. government can and should act to ensure that Uyghurs are not continuing to be exploited by the CCP. An approach that punishes the CCP for their actions holds accountable bad actors in the U.S. continuing to import those goods and provides relief for Uyghur survivors of forced labor and the ongoing genocide should be the goal of any U.S. policy. And I look forward to working with many on stage and also in the audience to make that a reality. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me here to speak. Appreciate the opportunity, and also would like to recognize some folks from our forced labor division who are really the heroes. We have several in the audience, thanks to them as well for everything they do. If I may, I'd kind of just like to start off with kind of how CBP plays into this really briefly, but then kind of discuss how we evaluate our performance in enforcing forced labor and the UFLPA the last few years, since the last 2 years, and then also kind of some successes, some challenges, and where we're going, what we're looking forward to in the next few years. In just kind of for a CBP 101, right? CBP tackles forced labor several different ways. First, using our 19 U.S.C. 1307 or Tariff Act of 1930 authorities, essentially prohibiting any goods made wholly or in part by forced labor from entering the United States. So if we receive an allegation of forced labor used to create a good, we'll investigate. If we determine there's reasonable suspicion that that good was made with forced labor, we'll issue what's called a withhold release order. And so we can detain those goods at the port of entry. If we have probable cause, we'll issue a finding so we can seize those goods. And right now we oversee about 51 WROs, withhold release orders, and the majority of those coming from China. The second part of what we do, kind of a major part of our mission set, is enforcing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And so although that act calls on multiple agencies to take action, CBP's primary role in that is enforcing the rebuttable presumption. And for anyone that's not tracking the rebuttable presumption, essentially any good, CBP is instructed to treat any good coming in with any goods made wholly or in part in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region or by a company on the UFLPA entity list. We presume those goods are made with forced labor, so they're not entitled entry to the United States. And when we kind of carry this out, we look at it 2 ways, kind of take 2 different approaches. The first, if we know it's coming straight from the XUAR, it's going to be automatically excluded unless you can prove otherwise. There is an opportunity for importers to prove that it's not made with forced labor. They have to prove to us with clear and convincing evidence that's the case, and request an exception. I can tell you that no one has succeeded in getting an exception. The other way we approach and we enforce this law is if you've got an import that may not be coming directly from the XUAR, we are evaluating the risks, right, of these imports. And if it's high risk, we're going to stop that good, and it could be subject to the rebuttable presumption. Now, importers do have the opportunity to prove to us that there is no nexus, that shipment, that good has no nexus, none of the components are made by a company on the UFLPA entity list or using any components from the XUAR, and they can prove that their shipment is not applicable to the UFLPA. But kind of, and then really talking about the entity list, Olivia mentioned the MC list. That's a broader forced labor enforcement task force initiative. CBP's role, really, we support those agencies as best we can. Our parent agency, the Department of Homeland Security, is chair of the FLETF, so anything we can do absolutely in support of that, of the entity list and adding companies to the entity list. So kind of how have we done in the last 2 years? So we've stopped over 9,700 shipments, valued at about $3.5 billion for review and enforcement action. Of that, we've denied about 4,000, valued at about $750 million entry into U.S. commerce. So we are making a financial dent in companies that are trying to import or trying to send goods to the United States made with forced labor, and we'll continue obviously to target, stop those goods as we learn more. The top goods, as you can see on our website, the sectors are electronics, apparel, footwear, and textiles, and industrial manufacturing materials. I think one thing I'd like to flag here is that when the UFLPA and the rebuttal presumption was announced, there's a lot of talk about is CBP, is this going to just grind trade to a halt? Are we going to destroy the economy? And part of CBP's mission is to facilitate lawful trade while also enforcing our trade laws. We're pleased to say that we've enforced the rebuttal presumption. We've been aggressive about it, but there haven't been any major disruptions to trade. On the entity list side, there are now 73 entities, I believe last time I checked, so it has grown significantly. A huge part of this is leveraging our trade partners, our industry partners, getting them to comply with the UFLPA, explaining to them why not only is this kind of a moral imperative to combat forced labor, but there's also significant financial liabilities, reputational risk to having facilities or to sourcing from the XUAR. So we're pleased to say we have seen changes in behavior. Companies are investing in due diligence. They are investigating in supply chain tracing. They know that it's better to get out of the region now. They know it's better to put in the work now than if their goods are detained, because then you have to prove otherwise. The burden is on you as the importer. Best thing to really do is to get out ahead of this. So we're seeing companies put in the time and effort to do that. We've got anecdotal evidence that goods coming directly from the XUAR have dropped significantly. So while we're still aware of things like transshipment, and I'll get to that in a bit, illegal transshipment, we are pleased to see that companies are changing their behavior. Kind of just as important, we're seeing what the rest of the world is doing as a result of the UFLPA. Not to sound arrogant, but we see ourselves, CBP, as really a catalyst for global action on this front. The U.S. government, the UFLPA, everything that comes with this is kind of the leader in combating forced labor. So we're seeing things now that the UFLPA has come out, now that we see you can enforce forced labor without destroying the economy. We're starting to see the European Union forced labor regulations. Canada, Mexico, other countries are stepping up and And as I kind of go more into some successes, I'd like to discuss in more detail our collaboration with our foreign partners. But what else have we done? So we've invested highly in technology. If for anyone's tracking cotton, there's a type of testing out there called isotopic testing, which essentially we can determine the country of origin for specific types of goods, especially cotton. We've invested $2.8 million into our laboratories, CBP's laboratories, so we have those in-house testing capabilities. Currently we're using our cotton testing to help us refine our targeting. So when we're looking at goods for potential enforcement, we want to make sure we're looking in the right place. So we're using that. We'll continue. We have 2 labs operational right now, and at least one more coming. We've invested heavily in supply chain tracing technology, so we know where the risks are. We never before have we had this great visibility in supply chains. Now we have these tools that we can dig into companies, see who they're sourcing from, where it's coming from, and that's helping us enforce the law. We're using machine learning and artificial intelligence to refine our targeting as well. You know, as the world is kind of embracing this technology, obviously we want to make sure we're using it to our advantage as well. We're investing in our people. We've improved the training for our personnel, for not only supply chain tracing, but also forced labor investigations in general. We're also bringing in more skill sets across the CBP enterprise, especially the Office of Trade Enterprise, which is where I'm from. For example, how can we use regulatory auditors to help us with our mission, right? Because they have certain skill sets that we may not have within the Forced Labor Division, within my directorate of the Office of Trade. We've also invested significantly in our foreign partners and in our stakeholder partners like civil society, industry, academia. You know, to be blunt, we could not do what we do. We would not have the success that we've had without civil society, without academia, without our external stakeholders. And credit goes to the businesses too that are making the effort to help us enforce the UFLPA and taking on those due diligence. For the last 2 years, we've had over 600 engagements with industry, with civil society, with foreign governments. We're putting as much resources out as we can on our website, video series, fact sheets, things you can do to be aware of forced labor, things you can do to avoid falling into the trap of forced labor within your supply chains. And we'll continue to do that. We're also providing significant amount of technical assistance to our like-minded foreign partners that are interested in taking the next step. For example, speaking with the European Union, Canada, Mexico, Japan, any country that's interested in enforcing forced labor more efficiently or coming at this problem, we will always be there to help. We are always there to provide to share our best practices, to tell you how we do what we do, what's worked for us, what you should consider if you have your own enforcement regime or rolling it out. But that said, challenges do remain for us. We'll continue to try to balance facilitating legitimate trade and enforcing trade laws that are on the books. Supply chains are very complex. Although we have developed significant expertise in-house on a lot of different kinds of supply chains, especially our centers of excellence, the personnel in those centers know what's in the supply chain. They know how these supply chains work, but there are a lot of different industries out there. There are a lot of different supply chains. We have to continuously educate ourselves on what's out there and how to be prepared for the next kind of supply chain that we have to do deep dive into. Bifurcated supply chains is another thing we're working on, where essentially it's if a company has one supply chain that is U.S. market bound, that is completely free of all inputs, but they have another supply chain that may have inputs that are higher risk. They may have inputs from the XUAR. if you're presenting evidence to CBP that your supply chain, right, that the goods you are presenting has a supply chain that is free of the XUAR nexus, that's free of the entity list, then under the UFLPA, those goods would be entitled entry to the United States. Now, if you have a bifurcated supply chain, please be aware, you're still high risk, right? You could still be a high risk because you've got these aspects of your business. You may, if you're sourcing from the XUAR, you may be subject to the criteria for addition to the entity list. But the point is, we are spending a lot. We have to spend time going through these packages if we know this company is high risk. But if they're able to prove otherwise for this supply chain, we're limited in what we can do. But again, we will continue any information we have that may prove otherwise. We'll share that with the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force and take whatever action we can. Illegal transshipment is another piece, and we had some members of Congress up here talking about that. The adversary's smart. They're trying to stay one step ahead of us. So goods are maybe coming from, I'll pick a country as an example, Vietnam, although they actually may have been made in the XUAR. We need to be aware of that, right? The best way to do that is to get as much information as we can about these goods. And I think that's where things like the potential changes to de minimis that will provide us more information, they'll help us combat illegal transshipment. So wrapping up, looking ahead, kind of the next 12 to 24 months, we're really focused on enhancing our enforcement, streamlining our processes, and building and improving those strategic partnerships. So from an enhancing enforcement perspective, are we using the most cutting edge technology? Reinvigorating our efforts to pursue penalties, as Olivia recommended, right? We have a team that's dedicated to developing penalties for trade issues. So digging more into that, refining our targeting, but also broadening our enforcement of the UFLPA to make sure we're covering all spectrums across the harmonized tariff schedule. And also using non-forced labor, non-traditional, techniques to help us find things. So for example, we're talking about to what extent can we leverage site visits or our trade regulatory auditors. And finally, kind of exploring the idea of conducting special enforcement operations on specific commodities. On the streamlined processes, kind of a component of this, essentially there are processes we have to follow, but anything we can do to automate those, any minute we save from an administrative procedure or process is a minute we can dedicate to enforcement, right? We can reallocate that. So automating everything, training our workforce, cutting out those unnecessary steps, those duplicative tasks to allow us to focus on enforcement. And also publishing guidance, updating our guidance to the trade community to help them be better prepared and to stay compliant with UFLPA. And finally, strategic partnerships. Right now, a lot of the folks we brought to this fight have been inside CBP, but there are a lot of U.S. government agencies. The FLETF, is a perfect example. It's the U.S. government coming together to enforce forced labor in general. But even for UFLPA and for CBP internally, there are other agencies that we can bring to the table on this. We are experts at enforcement. We may not necessarily be experts at labor rights. We may not be experts in seafood trade. So bringing in those different government agencies to help us tackle this. And also how we can use those agencies' authorities to deliver consequences. If there are some things that they can do that we can't, we are certainly interested in doing that so we can respond as the U.S. government as a whole when we do have a violation. And finally, international partners. Again, if other countries are going to become a dumping ground, companies can send their goods to the United States knowing that if for some reason they don't make it through, it's okay, we'll still make our profit shipping to another country. No one wants that. We don't want that. Our foreign partners don't want that. So anything we can do to share information, to provide technical assistance, best practices, again, we will lean in on that. And finally, last but not least, we'll continue to support the FLETF. I mean, that is it. It is huge for enforcement of the UFLPA. From a CBP selfish perspective, companies on the entity list give us information we need to quickly move and exclude goods, right? So we will continue to support that effort however we can. So with that, I'll wrap up and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm seeing the ushers going around. I've already received a bunch of questions here. Now let's start. Thank you so much for these very insightful presentations. Really interesting. Question for Alicia Hennig. What is your assessment of the Volkswagen audit, the leaked audit document, which is extremely shoddy? Are you surprised? What's your personal assessment, your professional take on it? And also, the new ILO criteria, how could they potentially be challenged? How could they be used to challenge businesses in the area of moral and other complicity?
Okay, so in essence, that's two questions, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, well, the Volkswagen audit, the interesting thing is I actually know a person at Volkswagen who was one of the drivers behind that audit because he mainly wanted to clear the table once and for all. I still don't know what to make of this. I think it was probably a good intention behind it, but also, a very corporate centristic interest, of course, to clear Volkswagen's name. I also know Markus Löning personally. I've been to his consulting agency several times. It is sort of unfortunate how it went. It doesn't really surprise me because, when you look back at the emission scandal, Volkswagen already cheated on its vast customer base. And, this is just another really big cheat, so to say. I don't know how they're going to move forward from this. I think they seriously undermined their credibility now, more substantially, actually, than ever before. The problem is, compared to the emission scandal, I don't see that people are really leveraging on this major trust crisis surrounding Volkswagen. So I don't know what's going to be the future of this. I just hope that at least MSCI will give them the red flag again, because it was super. I don't know. I don't think it was very responsible by MSCI to just take away the red flag only because there was an audit and there was so few information released on the audit. In parts I would also blame MSCI for that, honestly. The second one, the ILO. It's good to have this update on the criteria. It's good to see, hopefully, this criteria being incorporated into legislation. But as I mentioned in the presentation, the legislation has teeth, right? It would be wrong to say the European Union legislation doesn't have any teeth. But the problem is, it is a way, the procedure behind that to hold companies accountable, in my view, is way too bureaucratic. And this will sort of, slow down the process of holding companies, I think, accountable for what they are doing. So, it's good to have actually criteria that is in line with the real situation now, but it doesn't impact how we currently deal with companies' responsibilities and how we are holding them accountable in the future in the European Union. So I'm unfortunately not so enthusiastic about this, but maybe I'm just proven wrong, and in 3 years we will have great legislation in the Union.
I think while we're on the topic, there's an immediate follow-on question opportunity here. So I'm just going to seize that for the sake of the topic. Somebody's asking, so the recently adopted EU forced labor regulation, is that an opportunity to streamline or make EU law conform more to US law and practice on forced labor? And if not, why not? And I guess there's a question here, like to what extent do they differ? To what extent could this create alignment? You know, David has talked about the importance of international partner, of acting together globally to counter what is a global challenge. What's kind of your take on that, Alicia?
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I had just a call. Sorry for this. Could you please repeat the question?
Yeah, no problem. So somebody's asking basically the EU forced labor regulation.
Yeah.
And with David talking about the need to work together internationally, together multilaterally, does the EU forced labor regulation provide an opportunity to unite what the European Union and what the United States is doing to counter forced labor in law and in practice, or not? And if not, why not? How do you assess kind of the two?
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, does this person refer to the CSDDD? Because we don't have a forced, I mean, we're having a forced labor ban in the making, right? But that hasn't been, like, sort of approved yet. And then we have the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is, well, by some people depicted as the European supply chain law, right? And of course, that's also, that includes forced labor, but it also includes, for example, other human rights dimensions and also environmental perspectives. So when I look at the legal frameworks that have been developed or are in the making in the European Union, I think they differ substantially from what we can see in the United States, precisely because of the different mechanism behind it. So I personally would wish for more reconciling actually the two mechanisms, because what David actually pointed out is if we do not have a common ground that's very similar in terms of mechanisms, we may indeed end up with having countries being the dumping ground for certain goods, and we don't want to see this. So if we could just have more push on this in terms of, in my view, a more effective mechanism, I think we could have more effective legislation in the future. But unless I think we have this, the Union and the US will deal very differently with forced labor. And then the outcome will be different too, because we may see companies still operating or exporting to the Union market, whereas they cannot export to the US market anymore. So I find the situation, to be honest, very difficult, that there seems to be a split. But on the other hand, of course, these are like two very different regions, and they have, of course, they have a right to different approaches.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
I think that regardless of how the forced labor regulations shake out, you know, we have to take the legislation that we have between the countries and and harmonize to the maximum extent possible. Yeah. So even if we don't have the same laws, the same burden of proof, it's different. You know, I think there are some things that we can do between countries, between the EU and the US, for example, or really any countries. And that's where things like sharing best practices. If these companies, if these countries, if the EU, right, has investigations, how can we share our you know, our successes, our success stories with them? How can we share our methodology with them so that they can be as effective as possible at what they're doing? So,
can I just briefly add something to this? I think we also have a larger problem generally with economic interest driving our legislation, right? So that's actually the major problem we need to get hold of in order to then come up with better legislation. As long as economic interests prevail over our legislation and not the people's interests, right? I mean, we are talking about democracies. It's the demos, it's the people. It's not it's not economic actors. So once we get that clear, I think, yeah, there will be better legislation in the future. But as long as we don't tackle that major problem, I'm not so confident, unfortunately.
Very apt point. And of course, we did see the European Council, but the member states significantly diluting the EU law, whereas the Parliament had strengthened the initial proposal of the Commission, and the Council got their way, and there's no rebuttable presumption. And I was just kind of hoping that the updated ILO indicators, measurement framework could be leveraged, but again, that is a matter of political will, isn't it? Great challenges here, great challenges. David, Very interesting presentation. Now, one question here is, you spoke about cotton testing, in-house cotton testing. That's a great innovation. What results are you getting? Are you seeing Xinjiang cotton showing up at the border through your testing? Any percentages or any sort of insights? This must be some sort of a gauge, and Olivia mentioned, and they have, and somebody also in the questions complained CBP is not detaining enough, giving the magnitude of the question. But does this give you some kind of a proxy indicator to the magnitude of the problem and how it's being tackled?
So I can't get into the percentage that's come back testing positive, but again, what we're really using this to focus on, and again, this is a growing internal kind of capability for us, although there are companies that do this commercially. We're really using this not so much to see of the percentage of goods coming, what percentage of the goods coming to the U.S., what percentage of those are testing positive. We're doing this more as, okay, we are looking at this certain company or this certain area as being high risk for XUA or cotton. So we want to test it and make sure that our targeting is in the right place. That's kind of where we're coming from. So I can't really share specifics on the percentage, but again, this is one tool. It is not the end all be all. For example, we've said to industry, isotopic testing alone is not sufficient to prove that your goods are not applicable to the UFLPA. So again, this is one tool we're using with our supply chain tracing technology, with our expertise to determine where we need to enforce and where we need to target.
Thank you. David, there's another question. Olivia raised the comments that under USC 1592 and 1499, CBP might have existing authority to enforce fines on repeat offenders or to prohibit re-export. Now, we know that you're not sort of the top boss of the shop here in the room, but at the same time, what's your take on this? Do you agree that CBP has existing authority? You mentioned that there's existing thinking to apply some of this and potentially implement at least one of these two recommendations. But what is your take? Do you agree? And what's the likelihood of these recommendations being adopted?
So I think if there's, I'm going to answer the first part first. So one thing we consider at CP is that just because you re-export your goods does not mean that you have XUAR inputs. It's not an admission of guilt. So if we were to go about this in a way, we'd have to be very methodical about, okay, what is the definition of a frequent offender before we levy a fine. Fines are it's a pretty significant administrative process, so we'd want to kind of establish that at the outset. Do I think that I think that there's also probably different things we consider when we want to issue a civil penalty. For example, I kind of think of this as kind of different degrees of culpability, right? So you consistently are you're consistently re-exporting your goods because you haven't been able to prove otherwise. So that's a supply chain documentation issue. I think that is very different than you have had your goods excluded, so you send them to another country and then try to bring them back into the United States. I think that's a very different ballgame. So that is something that we are definitely looking at because goods that we've excluded, we don't expect to see them come back. It's clearly illegal. So that is kind of just from where I'm sitting, and I'm not prescribing agency policy. Those are the things we're looking at. fines are something we are looking into. If there's a way that we can leverage them to change behavior, we will do that. We just need to make sure that it's operationally feasible, that it stands up to the law. That's all I'd probably say on that.
Thank you. There's a question here whether forced labor in China affects Catholics, and don't think there's a lot of targeted research on that, but I can say that Catholics, underground Catholics who are not conforming to CCP regulations are being imprisoned and placed into various facilities, and certainly prisons in China use forced labor. And therefore, I would say that via this route, any sort of dissident group or oppressed religious group is naturally in that way subjected to forced labor, although I'm not aware of a particular program that targets them directly.
Adrian, could I also just add something really quick?
Yeah, please do. Please do.
So not necessarily answering the question about Catholics directly, but just a friendly reminder that Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act does cover more than just Uyghurs, and that it does extend to like any potentially vulnerable person who the CCP is subjecting to forced labor. And I know that there were like specifically like Kyrgyz, Kazakhs, Uzbeks were, I believe, listed by name, but then there was also comments on Tibetans, and then any, I think it's vulnerable or persecuted group that's subject to forced labor. I mean, even beyond UFLPA, the Tariff Act of 1930, which David was mentioning, prohibits any goods produced with forced labor from entering U.S. markets. And so we have authorities to use if the CCP, excuse me, were to expand forced labor to other groups as well. So I think that is important to bear in mind. And actually something very interesting is like, we don't have statistics on the number of goods that have been produced, say, by Tibetans that have come into the US and then been prohibited entry. And I think that would be a really interesting statistic to have. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Thank you for adding that. Thank you for adding that important point. Another question for David is regarding